Popper 9!
Popper 9! Oh my god!
Oh my
How
gosh.
exciting. Yeah.
Go on. Tell us how you got on with this one, Ailbhe.
Well, Popper 9, it's funny because I read an interview with some guy who did like this Popper project before, and they said, which one do you think is the hardest? And he said Popper 9, and kind of like looked shamedly about Popper 9. And it's funny because it is, there's no doubt about it, it's tricky, but it's funny because it's amazing what things like that do. I actually think it depends when you've actually done Popper 9. If you do it as the first double stop Etude that you learn with all this pressure, and not that you should have a huge amount of pressure, but with the actual strength training you need for your thumb, if it's the first one, it's going to be hard. It's going to be tricky, and it needs a certain type of practice. So even though it definitely is a brain melt to figure it out, no doubt about it, figuring out whether you're in your open, closed positions, major, minor, whichever way you work it out, it's going to take a bit of time to develop this one, I think. Again,
for sure.
not a 1 weeker. But I did kind of enjoy it, even though it's really, I think this one is a challenge. But I think it's a beautiful piece, and I think well done to Popper for making something so pretty out of a mountain of double stop.
Yeah, totally. Wow, that's really interesting. Well, it's interesting to me because I wouldn't, for me personally, I wouldn't say this is the hardest Popper study we've even done so far, by a long shot.
Me
But
neither.
But I think the thing is, it's all about, and this has been a wonderful year of exploration for me, to see which parts of my technique are pretty strong and which parts aren't. And of course, like we talk about this all the time, like I do double stops a lot. So for me, this study is not, but however, I am like, man, maybe I'm really missing something on this because I can do double stops, but I think maybe this week with the Popper 9, like really exploring how perfect and like absolutely beautiful you can get these double stops, where it's sort of that thing, like if you run every day and you've run for 10 years and then someone asks you to do a 5K, it's not going to be, that big of a deal. And I think it's the same with stuff like this. If you're practicing your double stops, like be kind to yourself, because if you don't do it every day, it's going to be more of a challenge. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It's totally possible. It just takes more time and focus. And like, I think a lot of self-care, be kind. Don't get angry at yourself because it takes time.
Yeah, and as someone who does not practice their double stops every day, I'm going to put my hand up there. You know me, I practice whatever's the next concert is coming up. So often there is not enough time in the day to spend. Now, maybe I should get up earlier and that would solve that problem. But when I'm approaching something like this, I have to be very careful that I do this practice in installments. You cannot do this piece practicing from no double stops thumb practice with this thumb muscle. You cannot go from nothing to an hour of practice, even out is too much. 4 hours and you have an injury and you can't play for 6 months. So you have to do maybe, would we even say if you're starting off from the very beginning, a minute, and then go off and practice something else, and then come back and do a minute later, do some stretches, come back and do a minute later, and then day 2 and day 3 you can maybe raise it up to like 2 minutes in stations, and then go and do that. So because we had just done that other one 27 recently enough, I can't remember the numbers.
Yes, 26 I think it was.
Yeah, there you go. I knew you'd remember it. So basically, if you're already well in shape, like you say, then of course you can spend a bit longer. But you still can't spend a couple of hours practicing this, so you do have to space it out 3 or 4 times in a day with like self-massage and whatever else you need to be able to make that work.
I'm literally sitting here with my thumb resting on my
Me too.
my leg like that, stretching it out. But that's the thing.
You can do.
Yeah. Now, listen, tell me this. Did you have any sort of like what I would call everyday spots in this, which are like 1 or 2 bars in particular in different areas that you would say absolutely gonna go here first and make sure that's really
I
looked
did.
at?
As far as 18, 19 and 20. making sure that my transfer of weight and the balance over the fingers playing was so important. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, am I going to shift with my thumb in mind or the other finger? For this, just going straight across doesn't necessarily give you the right interval. You have to actually adapt your whole hand to the new strings. So for me, that was the one that took a bit of a brain melting to work out.
I agree. Those were definitely, I think, some of the hardest parts for me as well. I think, we talked a lot about in that other double stop study, about the like different hand positions and kind of the mental side of figuring out double stops. But I think particularly another challenge in this area is the physicality, like you were talking about. For me, again, it's my personal hand anatomy makes this quite tricky, and I bet it's tricky for everyone, right? But for me, I have to do a massive amount of rotation to go anything that's extended backwards in thumb position with this closed one to thumb takes a lot of extra physicality. So I think it's kind of a two-pronged thing when I'm analyzing this. I would be looking at, number one, are you looking at, is it hard for your brain? And is it hard for your hand? Because I think double stops are both. And sometimes it is really hard for your brain and your hand. But like understanding what the problem is and how you have to focus on each issue, I think is helpful.
Yeah. Another little area that I would always check, because there's so much movement, was so often there's so many different movements of your finger, but you still need to think about it in the phrase. So it actually moves through and you don't get slower and slower and slower as you're kind of like, which finger, where am I? Oh yeah, there's so much brain power with all of that.
That sounded so beautiful, what you just demonstrated, by the way. It really did.
Thank you. But I'm laughing at even as I got to bar 30, quite often I'd be like, it's way too slow before it should be, and really moving through. And not letting yourself take time just because it's technically difficult. And again, this can be a classic study where everything is da-da-dum, da-da-da, a little too mechanical, a little too technical. Really.
Talking about music, Andante sostenuto. This is another challenge, I think, with Popper, because in double stops, which we've discussed before, it's so important, anything in thumb position really, is to find moments of release. I wonder if Popper wrote the, marking of this Andante sostenuto because he wants to challenge us to find the release in the left hand, but not in the bow. So, and having the independence between the two hands to achieve that. Yeah. So, a lot of times we are so focused on the difficulty of the technique that we'll, leave aside these other things. And I think he's saying, well, guys, this is when you really need to spend a few weeks on, because even if you can master those double stops, it's all about the bow, isn't it? I mean, it's all about how you're letting the bow get this music to speak. And I mean, it is music. Like, as you've said, we can't just play it like a bunch of different short little bursts of double stops.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, that brings us to another interesting thing, because what would you think sostenuto means there?
I think he's asking us to have a very lyrical line, a woodwind instrument or vocal line, these thirds everywhere. As
exactly.
you sang.
So, well, this is the interesting thing for me, because actually I've heard a lot of people doing which is very distinct. But I'm not convinced. This is a classic piano-cello difference. So some people would say these are bowings, and some people would say that they're slurrings. So if you were a pianist, you would have a little Yeah, and it's still sustained
Yeah.
in between the
Totally.
slurs. So I think you can actually play it both ways. So I think
Yeah.
often cellists get a bit confused with, oh, it's a bowing, so I'll just make sure everything is long.
I agree with you completely here, and I also think it's very classical. This the tonality of this is very classical, so it would make me, in classical music we tend to release more. Mind you, in some places, like once we get to the really tricky bit, I think there the texture changes, and we don't want to release as much. Just personal taste,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did the same thing myself. So another phrasing point for me was into bar 9. So that's one little sub phrase for me. And then, so it's like a sentence, right? So I just love, I love finding little things in here that will just take you out of Terminator double stop mode and thinking about how you can actually think about phrase structures overall, because they're really pretty, fair play, Popper.
Yeah. By the way, I guess we should just do a quick definition for people who don't know what we're talking about. It's a sentence is 2 + 2 + 4, right?
Yeah, so it's or like, I mean, now I'm
like 1 1 2.
Yeah, so basically a sentence is really just like 2 short bits followed by a long bit. So
well, the 2 shorter bits at the beginning are related material, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm practicing 18-1 at the moment. Oh, sorry. Have you ever played that? That quartet?
Have I? I have actually. I only played that at Christmas. I love the way I was like, I don't recognize that bit. That shows how much rehearsal we did. I'm kidding. We did loads. It was a lovely concert. Yeah, it is a cool piece, isn't it?
It's just you have a lot of music you learn all the time, so it's hard to keep it all in there.
Is that it? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, I don't remember. I opened this book, Ailbhe, and I'm like, did we do that one? Did we? I'm not sure.
Seriously.
Bar 28, when you were playing, that's quite a tricky bar for the finger independence, isn't it? And I think again, I find it really helpful to do a sort of stoppy-starty practice. So we can be really organized about which finger's moving where, then maybe grouping 2 together. Stuff like that.
And rhythms would also be good if one had time to practice. It would be really good to do. Etc. I didn't do that very well, but
No, you did. Similarly, the bar 50, same dealio. Anytime you have one voice that's moving and the other one's staying. Type of thing.
Absolutely.
I mean, it happens a lot of places, doesn't it? But
yeah. So interesting differences between international and the Baron-Writer. The bar 22, they actually slur in the first 6 notes. In the international.
Ah.
And funny enough, in the Baron-Writer, when I was playing what they have, or whatever it was, I was always getting just a tiny bit of an accent on the second beat, and I didn't really like it. So I reverted. Because of that open string, it's quite hard to balance, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating area because I don't know about you, but in that bar 22, because you're balancing, you want to balance slightly more to the lower string, right? Or do you want? for me, I just didn't want the open A string coming out too much, so I lowered maybe a little bit more towards the lower string, and then that also means that whenever you release the open string again, you have to be quite careful not to give a big or anything like that, or else that A string, it's quite hard to balance that nicely without giving a big like in the middle.
I mean, you brought up a really good point within that too, that when we're balancing double stops, we need to think about the timbre of the string, and that's going to be different on every cello, but usually the A string speaks much more easily than the D string, right? So, you know, even if you want it to sound completely balanced, if, you know, that's your taste in that place, you're probably going to need to balance a lot more to the D string. And then I think another point is to remember, especially, you know, it's to do with tessitura as well. So when you're playing a note that's a lot higher in pitch, we're going to hear it more clearly. So a good example of this is 46. When we go to the octave, so on the D string, I'm going down to a lower pitch, and I'm going up to a higher pitch on the A string. If I played it absolutely balanced, now I exaggerated that, but it will stick out like that. So you have to really, even within a small phrase, adjust the balance constantly. And I think that is the other hidden challenge in this. It's, you know, again, like when you're used to playing this stuff, you'll do it kind of naturally, but I think making decisions about the balance constantly, it's never one, you know, sustained kind of sound for the whole section, is it? It's always constantly this bow balance between the two strings that's going to need to adjust slightly, I think. And of course there's some patterns, you know, but generally I think that's really important.
That's brilliant. Yeah, and for me, I think certainly when I'm approaching double stops at the beginning, I always want to hear more of the lower note in order to tune, so keep my bottom note very basically always the one that I listen to in pitch. And then, so when you are practicing this, it's really good to be able to actually, you have to pick one line to listen to.
Yeah.
And mostly it's going to be the bottom, and then you can just adjust your top. Whereas if you try to just both together, you're like an ice skater who just can't get their feet back together. So sometimes you're actually taking a double stop from a note above. So you have to change around your thought process, but you have to make those decisions, or else it just won't end well for anyone.
And
cool.
I think also, the last point, I mean, I'm sure we've talked about this before, but it's a really good idea when you're practicing things with a lot of double stops to just play one voice at a time. That's like usually step number one. I have to say I didn't do that much this week on this because I had played it in the past and it was sort of in my ear, but that is usually number one thing I would do, absolutely. And then like practicing the actual double stop and the spacing of the hand, but just with one pitch at a time. So it's not information overload.
I do highly agree, just to give an example for that you don't just do, you have to actually have your hand in the position that it's going to be playing the top note as well. So let's say we find, so we start, so you're actually playing the upper and the bottom note in fingerings and left hand, but only playing one string. And then doing the same thing. So even there I can see that my first finger is not prepared. That kind of idea. And then you put them back, and my favourite, you know, is this idea. That's a great opportunity to think about your shifts, because you really do need to release so much. You have to, that feeling that you would always do with a shift with one finger, you have to do with both. How did you approach that shift there in order to get a really clear shift?
I think
So
as
this
you
shift.
just demonstrated.
Yeah, go on.
So just watching you play, I see a lot of up and over in your arm and hand, and I think that's definitely what has to happen. So when I'm on the 1 and 3, I'm thinking of those as like a pivot point. So that's quite a challenge in this. Is you've got it in tune, but can you stay in tune as you're preparing the balance in the hand for something else? Which, if you can, you are like super. I mean, it's hard. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, absolutely. It's just interesting to see how people do it. I thought as well, it's really good to know that this, for me, is a closed position. Open. So you think about those minor thirds versus the major thirds. So now that I know where I'm going, then... And for me, it was the later I left it. If I leave it just quite late, then I don't get so much dirty slide and grossness. So later and lighter, I think, in general, and then that will keep your hand fresh, free. There's a little bit of suspension going on. Good to go.
When you say later, I would like to clarify. I think probably you would agree with me on this, that it doesn't mean that you're gonna like move your arm really quickly and late. There's still that preparation always, right? But it's the timing of actually when the shift happens. But I think in order to do things, cleanly and late, it's all about this anticipation, like the understanding that we're going somewhere. I'm not just sat here the whole time.
Yeah.
It's always having a sense of of like kind of. I think Tim Gill talked about it really well in the video he did. It's this idea of we're always going to be going somewhere, so just kind of be like, hey buddy, don't get too set up here.
Yeah, and I should say as well, to clarify that I don't mean late in rhythmic time notions. You can do a shift really slowly. So that's really what I've done there, is I've started so early after the second semiquaver that it's a disgustingly soupy shift. So instead, just leaving your shift, the actual moment that you go, just a split second later, and then you end up with a cleaner shift at the end.
Totally.
Okay. Are we
doing this? Yep, let's do it.
Who's on first? Is it me or you?
It's me. We always remember when it's our turn to go first, I've noticed. All right.
Exactly.
Wish me luck.
Have fun.
Woohoo! Epic!
Nice job.
Oh, thanks.
It's really lovely to listen to. Actually, it's
Is
a
it?
beautiful piece. Yeah, it really is. It's so pretty.
Wow.
I like it. Nice
It kind
job.
of is. Oh, well, thank you. Could have done with a little bit more practice on my transitions, I think. But it's funny because you kind of go. You tell me what you feel afterwards, but you kind of go into this complete blind. I find it so much. There's so
panic?
much going on. Well, sort of. It's like there's so much going on that my brain goes to its happy place. It's like I just feel like
where mine goes.
a trained monkey, just like it's doing whatever it's gonna do.
Thank you.
Well
thank you.
done. Seriously, like
Well
whoa,
done,
high
us.
five.
Well done.
I know.
Yoo-hoo.
I know. Like, man,
Oh my
everything
God.
seems easy after you do that, doesn't it?
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Like it's quite funny, isn't it?
So, anyway,
So let's see you next
listen.
week, right?
Yes, have a
Yay.
great time, and yeah,
Thank you. You
we'll
too.
see you
Have a
soon.
lovely week.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.